I will start by saying you're Robert Siegel. You've reported on a million different cases of unrest. You've seen the Soviet Union fall. You've told me in the past how you sort of had one of your formative experiences in the Colombia unrest. What do you, is this like anything you've seen before? What do you see?
Well, I mean, to be fair, no, it's like nothing I've seen before, really. This was given that this took place in Washington, D.C., and given that this was a crowd of people who, a couple of whom carried Confederate flags, but who, for the most part, were wrapped in the stars and stripes with a sense of entitlement that this was their Congress to go in and break the windows of. And I found it unlike anything I've seen in actually, Washington is such a really beautiful city, certainly in its monumental center, that even protests that have a real edge of grievance to them are quite often rather happy and rather upbeat because you're in this beautiful mall and the monuments are very awe-inspiring and the buildings are beautiful. So the notion of of an angry, people call it a mood of insurrection, uh, and I have to admit, seeing that as an almost entirely white protest was all that was all pretty new. I'd have to search for any parallels. You mentioned my origins at in the undergraduate protests at Columbia, where I was the guy on the radio during that time.
Oh, you were covering them.
Covering it,
Yeah,
yes.
you
And
weren't out there protesting.
one thing that that took me right back yesterday was a picture of a rioter who'd broken into the Senate chamber and taken the seat of the vice president,
Yeah.
the chair on which the presiding officer of the Senate sits, whoever that may be. And it was an empty chamber, and there was this protester, rioter, whatever, sitting there. And it took me back to a photograph. I don't like the word iconic, but this, I think, achieved iconic status because it was a Life magazine photograph of a classmate of mine, actually, who in the sit-in at the university president's office at Columbia in 1968, dipped into the president's humidor and was seen smoking a presumably expensive cigar. In effect, adding insult to injury or vandalism. In effect, saying, "Here, big shot, look at me. I'm sitting in your seat of power and authority, and I'm invading the privacy of your desk."
Mm-hmm.
And that particular image took me back to the to 68, which for me, all of the past several 4 years has been for me the benchmark of craziness. That is, whenever anyone would say the country has never been this crazily divided or this angrily divided, I've always thought, well, we haven't had the equivalent of the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy.
A single year, yeah.
We haven't had as many universities flaring up one after the other in a very unpopular way. We didn't have someone running for president, George Wallace, who was not a dog whistle racist. He was a segregationist. And he actually, I checked recently, he only did 6 electoral votes worse than Barry Goldwater, who had run as a Republican 4 years earlier.
Wow.
In 1968. That's how well George Wallace did. He carried those. So for me, 68 has always been the standard for madness and for concerns about stability of the country. And I have to admit that over the past year, my confidence that 1968 was a loonier year and a more worrying year than recent years has been waning. And yesterday would certainly rank right up there in the tipping points for me.
Well, what do you think? Is that a tipping point? Is this crazier than anything the country saw in '68 or
It's pretty crazy.
'63 for that
It's
matter?
it's it's pretty crazy. I mean, the big differences between uh, camps of protesters and counter protesters in 1968 had to do with things like, is the government lying about the Vietnam War? You know, is in fact this effort really doomed, and they keep on talking about the light at the end of the tunnel that they're going to see.
The war and in the
Um,
war, you mean?
Excuse me?
In the
In the
war.
war, in the
Yeah.
war, yeah. And that to me was a much more rational argument, that is between protesters and supporters of the uh, of the war, than the QAnon theses that evidently animated quite a few of the people who were out there and who have been protesting, which I find. I mean, I am surprised that as many as, who knows, 20, 30, 40 million Americans believe that the election was stolen in 2020, and they seem to believe that with a perfect faith. You know, what can we say? They seem to be unshakable in their conviction that
Right.
a terrible fraud is being worked on President Trump.
And they're getting it either directly from Trump or through QAnon, right? I mean, they're getting this from someplace that.
Uh, yes, they seem to get it. I mean, I think mostly from Trump. I think he's without him, I don't know how influential QAnon would be in this case. But he's repeated endlessly that the election was stolen from him. And just yesterday, in what was ostensibly a call to peace, he restated his belief that he'd won the election by a landslide.
A
And
sacred landslide.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, yeah. Well, yeah.
and that's I mean, this was as litigated an election as we can have. I mean, there, as we know, the number of lawsuits that were brought. There were recounts. It was a very strange election because just a few months ago, you may recall, E.J. Dionne, my friend, was sounding the alarms that when Maryland and the District of Columbia, two jurisdictions not known for voter suppression, they don't have a history in that direction, barely known for contested elections, frankly, failed miserably in pulling off primaries in the spring because of the pandemic. That between election poll workers who couldn't work, the number of polling places was greatly reduced, and EJ very wisely alerted us to we were headed for disaster, that places were incapable of pulling off a functioning election because of the pandemic. And the country heard that warning and warning from other people and managed to put together a functioning election. And of course, the strangest lesson of 2020 is that by making it easier to vote, and by making it easier, as it has been in Virginia, where I live for some years now, to vote absentee with no excuse, just I'd rather vote early or whatever. We had the greatest participation. You could also say that there was more passion going into this vote,
Right.
no matter what. But I think between that passion and the special arrangements that were made for the year of the pandemic and the shift toward non-election day in-person voting, we had 150 million people take part in the presidential election. I mean, I used to chart the presidential turnout compared to the Super Bowl audience, which were, somewhere in the low 100s. They would be I thought they were the two events in which the country did the same thing one day.
Right.
But the Super Bowl isn't going to, it's never come close to 150 million people. So the country pulled off this rather remarkable election, I thought. And everything that happened was taken in this group of people who were represented by the rioters in Washington as further proof that the truth is being denied, and Donald Trump is being denied. And I've had this argument with someone recently, which is a lie, not a lie, if a person believes that to be the
Mhm.
case. That is, which raises the question: does President Trump truly believe that he won by a landslide? He's very impressed with his 70 million whatever votes, but he seems to completely ignore the 80 million votes whatever that Joe Biden got.
Right. What do you
Uh,
think? Does he believe it all the time? Some of the
I
time?
can't figure it out. I can't figure. I think that I think that he comes from an experience in which fact and reality, everything is on the table, and we're in the business of making deals, and just as people may bring strange starting positions to a bargain, or they might, they might ask for extremes. His extreme is, I won the election by a landslide. Now, where do we go from here, guys? How do you,
Right. Let's
as
see.
we heard him tell the Secretary of State of Georgia,
Right.
there was a moment that sounded like, so what can you do for me here? I mean,
Right. Here's
what
what
I
I
need is
think.
11,780 votes.
Yeah. Well,
So,
his biographer Tony Schwartz said as much about writing his, not his
yeah,
biographer, his ghostwriter, who did his
yes, the
art of
deal,
the
or
deal, came
yeah,
out around the time of the election and basically said his relationship with reality is like that. It's purely transactional.
yeah,
You say what you need to say, you believe what you need to believe, and you get what you need. But
yeah,
so it's interesting though, all of this. I mean, you're talking about these, like, these images that recall other images from 68, or
yeah,
any number of other things, or this sense of people seizing sacred sanctuaries. And there's this kind of photo negative quality, I think, for a lot of us. It's very unusual to be on the side emotionally of the, say, in your example, say, sort of the university president, right? I
yeah.
mean, it's odd to have the passionate rioters. I mean, you speak of them more empathetically than most people I've heard, saying, here's what they believe, here's how the world looks to them. But what is that like for us spectators?
Oh, I think it's. I mean, I don't want to let my remarks sound too sympathetic. That would be misleading. I mean, I think there's a mob madness at work there, and there's a contempt for others. That there's a belief that people who are not in on the secret wisdom of QAnon, or of the Trump family, or wherever they got it from, is they're, if they're not part of the solution, they're part of the problem. And I think that there's something very hostile about that. It's I did catch something on. I was channel surfing at some point during all this, and began watching Fox for a while to see how they were handling things. And there was a reporter who made a remark it was just an offhand remark, which obviously reflected some of his earlier reporting, but I hadn't seen the earlier reporting. I'm not sure it was ever on. When he was asking people how they felt about confronting the police, when he said, when so many of you have a background in the military or in law enforcement.
Mm.
And I didn't know where the
Huh.
basis of that came from, but it did turn out that the woman who alas died inside the Capitol was an Air Force veteran who
Right.
had served 2 deployments, I believe. Um, and I think that that may be part of the sense that what I saw is that sense of entitlement to have our house because we served. We've
Oh.
served the country,
Huh.
and I don't know, but it's I find it very disturbing because it's hard to see what I can see how a certain um part of the traditional Republican Party, which I think of as a party of management and of uh, conservative mores, let's say.
Mhm.
I can see a lot of that that part of the party being repelled by what happened at the Congress and saying, "I want no part of that." And some Republicans, a small number, but some have distanced themselves from it. But I don't see what the I don't think I can't hear the conversation. I haven't been out as a reporter in recent years, so I have had no occasion to have the conversation. But I can't. I just don't imagine the meeting of minds over this question of was there a massive criminal conspiracy to work a fraud in the 2020 presidential election, and were the dozens of courts that threw out legal challenges, were their actions further confirmation of how deep the deep state goes? And it seems to be there's the potential there for us to really be stuck in a failure to communicate with common facts, with a share of the American people who are, after all, our they are our neighbors, they are our fellow Americans, and we can't wish them away any more than they can wish us away. And I see a very I just don't understand how one reconciles a question. I don't think there's any fact-finding body, whether it's the 9/11 Commission style or, my God, the Warren Commission report was instantly published and no one believed it. It seemed to make the problem worse. So I can't imagine national hearings about election, how the election was carried out, that would make people feel a little bit more trustworthy of the government. So
Well,
that's worrying and discouraging.
yeah, even listening, if you stayed up, I stayed up for the last round of objections last night. I just could not look away from
Wow.
it.
Wow.
And even the people rising in the House, one after the other, to make this argument in favor of the Pennsylvania objections, seem to be in an unreachable fact universe. I mean, and you say we can't ignore these people; they're our neighbors. There are congressional representatives. It's very
Yeah. Yeah.
it's very unusual. I wonder if there's I know you've been reading a lot of history since you retired. I wonder if there are other periods in American history that could in any way be like this, maybe pre-Civil War.
Well, what I was thinking of is that I was thinking, are we especially, do we have a history of mob violence and politics? Do we have a history of less mob violence than others? Obviously, the Civil War stands out as our greatest violent confrontation. But we also, if you think back, we learn in school, I assume people still learn in school, about Shays' Rebellion and the Whiskey Rebellion. And we have a history of people, veterans who felt that they should have been paid better for their service in the war, actually.
Oh, that's interesting. That was the Whiskey Rebellion?
Complaining that, well, these were the individuals, but the complaint was they're being taxed too much. And
there you go.
Which is a long-running theme in American life. But I was struck by something, which is that we don't celebrate our conquest of Shays and Shays' Rebellion or the Whiskey Rebellion, and even when it comes to the Civil War, the kind of national view that was dominant when I was growing up was more about the reconciliation of northern and southern whites having sold out blacks, basically.
Right,
But
right.
that wasn't mentioned. With the brother and brother embracing at Gettysburg 50 years later was the kind of image that I recalled being sold on. And I was struck by a contrast that I'd read of recently, which was the French, who have had any number of political uprisings and riots in their modern history. On our honeymoon, my wife and I sat at the Café Cluny and watched a minor riot, the front row seat between a group of Trotskyists and riot police in riot gear. And
what year was this?
This was 1973.
Sure.
1973,
Yeah.
and this was after they'd had a virtual a civil war over Algeria and all. But what I remember reading was that it wasn't until the late 19th century that the French chose their national day, and they chose the storming of the Bastille as
Ah,
the national day. The Bastille at the time had about, I think it's 8 prisoners in it. It was a symbol of royal authority, but it didn't really. Rather few people were liberated. And the writer wrote that they could have, looked a month later and chosen the writing of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen as their founding moment of the Republic. And indeed, the Marquis de Lafayette and Thomas Jefferson worked together on this document, but they chose the violent uprising instead to celebrate, and I thought that that's something that we as Americans we don't do. We it's not that we don't have a violent political history, but we tend to celebrate the moments of healing and coming together, and maybe make more of our civility than there really is. We certainly like the idea, I think,
yeah. Well,
that
that
we're a
leads to
largely peaceable country.
yeah. Well, that leads to a question of how this will. I mean, if you care to prognosticate, I mean, what will this do to the Trump legacy, if there is one? Is this sort of all he'll be remembered for? I mean, sort of this sort of will this leave a bad taste in everyone's mouth, or is this going to change? Are we going to start? Are we going to have a group of people who see this as tear down the elites? Abat les arists, right?
Amy, yeah, I think the answer is yes, is the answer to your question. I think that, yes, this will leave a bad taste in the mouth. And yes, the abandonment of Donald Trump by traditional Republicans, by some number of them, will contribute to some fair consensus as to what his presidency was all about and what was wrong with it.
Mm-hmm.
But yes, there will be people for whom this is he's an adored figure, and he did turn out more votes than any incumbent president. I a still farther fetched allusion than the French and their National Day. I remember reading Gershon Scholem many years ago, and when he wrote about the affection of the Sabbateans, Jews who were underground Jews and above ground Muslims, and who venerated a false Messiah, Shabbatai Tzvi.
Oh, right, yeah.
And yes, and what I thought was very brilliant was he talked about how these were communities that had been through the Converso experience in Spain, and they had been families that had lived one life privately, secretly, and another life publicly. And that people who do that, Scholem wrote, were they could more easily mistrust reality. They could mistrust the everyday reality that we all see in common, and believe that really this false Messiah who had caved actually when he was confronted and embraced Islam. If you spend a lifetime being one thing in secret and something else in public, it gets easy to start believing secret conspiratorial theories, and I've been reminded of that, which is, I mean, how is it that people can honestly believe that the Democratic Party is a pedophile conspiracy of cannibals? It just doesn't make any sense. But there may be something there about just not believing in the reality of everyday life, and finding something that's essentially not there. I mean, untrue. I mean, we're talking about a president who came to national fame. I guess he already had national fame as a writer of books, but he was host of a program in a genre that we call reality television. This is not reality.
Right, meaning the opposite. Yeah.
it means the opposite. And I think that that there are people who uh, perhaps it's part of hearing government accused of lying a great deal, and it's a very highly elevated level of cynicism.
Hmm.
But for some reason, there's an ability I think these people have to dismiss the common everyday reality that you and I may recognize, that in fact they counted the votes, they recounted the votes, they counted them by hand, they checked the signatures. That's the total. To some of these folks, it's just all it's just more lies. They
Right.
you know
It's
the people weren't allowed within 5 feet of the people who were counting, so they couldn't see. People were,
right.
there's always a reason as to how the ostensible reality that we accept is not real. And that's, I don't know how we get over that. I don't know how how we bridge a gap of facts of that sort.
Right. I've always the one question I've always wanted to ask, say I ever came to grips with one of these people and had a
Yeah,
conversation with them, which it's hard to it's hard to do. I always thought it would be interesting to ask, like, supposing, imagine that you could be shown evidence that the election wasn't rigged and that, in fact, the election was honest. How would you feel about that? Would you be happy and relieved that, oh, the election is honest after all? Or would you be
yeah.
even more upset? And I mean,
You know, I think that we have to be prepared to recognize in ourselves uh, a a lifestyle that revolves around learning and reading and evolving and enjoying evolving. I'll tell you a story. It's that I'm reminded of it because he figures in Barack Obama's memoir, which I just reviewed for a
which
moment.
which I'm going to
Henry
ask you
Louis
about.
Gates.
Yeah,
Oh, good. Henry Louis Gates Jr., Skip Gates,
yeah.
wrote a memoir some years ago, and I did an interview with him where my producer and I went off to his hometown in West Virginia, and we interviewed him there and met his high school friends and met his father, and his father was a taciturn man. Skip Gates is one of those people who he wasn't born Henry Louis Gates Jr. As an adult, he took the name Henry Louis Gates,
Oh, really?
Henry Louis Jr. as a tribute to his father. That is,
Oh,
he renamed himself for his
wow.
father. I can't remember what he was born. Yeah, so he was very close to his dad,
Yeah.
and I interviewed Skip many times, and once it was for the PBS DNA genealogy show that he started,
Right.
uh, and um, and he told the story of his own family, which he had done, and how he had the first thing which my producer thought was the least surprising news was that he had a tad of Ashkenazi Jewish DNA.
Of course.
But Skip told the story that he'd been raised on, that they were related to a family in town, a white family, and that a couple of generations back, his whatever it was, great grandfather married someone or had a child by so and that they were related to them. And and Skip described his confrontation with his father when he had to say, we did the DNA, and we also did DNA from the white family, and I know that everybody believes that in the family, but there's no connection. And so I said, well, what did your father say? And he said, I can tell you where you can go stuff your DNA. We are related to that. We are related to
Right.
that family.
Right.
And
There you go.
there's this, there's a certainty you come by because it's what you've grown up with and what you've heard all your life. That's unshakable. And uh, maybe you could go to an elder hostel and take a course in DNA and be persuaded of something, but I think not. I just think we come by our certainties in
Mm,
different ways, and we should. When I say we, I'm using you and me as representative of a group, kind of people who would work for a magazine or a newspaper or a radio network.
right.
That we're very comfortable with the idea of coming by proof of something that we hadn't known was true before,
Mm,
and adjusting our view of the world ever so much to this new information. That describes part of being alive.
hmm
But there are equally people, I think, who would find uh, would find it absolutely uh, nuts to think that the truths that you're raised on, and that your parents knew for sure, and their parents knew for sure, how could they be wrong? Come on, this
Right.
is what certainty is.
Could be challenged by a mere fact. Well, we say that about ourselves. I agree with you that that's our instinct, particularly as
Yeah.
journalists. But even in Washington, it's very difficult to change your mind about something major. I mean, I always used to say,
Yeah.
if you change your mind, I was watching those guys, the few senators, what was it, 7 senators who went from yes objecting to no, we're not going to object, and they
Uh,
basically got up and said, we were going to do this, but now we have decided we were wrong.
yeah.
And I thought how remarkable it was to hear that in Washington, where if you really change your mind
Yeah.
about a political point, you have to not only change your job, but like get all new friends.
Yes. Yes.
Right.
Langford of Oklahoma was one of those who I thought was very interesting. Curiously, Kelly Loeffler from Georgia, who arrived fresh from her defeat in the special election runoff, she retracted her opposition.
Yeah.
It was a very strange argument. I mean, we should bear in mind before we uh, diminish responsibility for what happened in Washington, that the act of the mob was to interrupt Congress from performing its ceremonial duty of counting the electoral votes.
Right.
And in fact, what was going on inside was a legislative maneuver whose aim was to delay Congress from doing its ceremonial duty of counting the electoral votes. So they were of a piece, the two
Right.
actions, the legislative
Right.
action and the mob scene. And in fact, the argument that a lot of Trump's, I would think of them as semi-enthusiastic supporters on this issue, was that even if in fact the election was honest, and each one would say, and there were many things that I was greatly concerned about, and irregularities in this
Right.
election. There are so many Americans who don't believe in the outcome that we owe them this act of transparency, which of course would mean having either a 2-hour debate at 1 o'clock in the morning, or having some odd commission study the election for maximum 10 days, because we'll be inaugurating the president. It was a position that one could climb down from, but the two acts, the legislative act to say, let us try to throw a wrench into this very simple activity of the Congress in counting the electoral college votes, and a mob breaking in to stop the Congress from counting the electoral college votes, had at their core the same motive and the
Mm.
same lack of respect for what was really only a matter of ceremony.
Right. And a lack of respect for sort of underlying reality.
Yes, exactly.
But
And
where does, so that's interesting. I thought, so that in that sense, so you're saying that the people who climbed down from the legislative position, maybe they just felt they didn't want to be shown up. They didn't, once it took the form of mob action, you couldn't be associated with it anymore.
I think so. I think that they recognized that they were, I mean, in part, they were making the president feel better, that they're showing that they would go the last mile here for the president's sense of being dealt with fairly.
Mm.
And then when witnessing, what what the president's supporters thought was a fair way of redressing their grievance. I think some of them were just appalled that I think they recognized the unity of purpose of the objections that they were voting on, and the protest that was taking place outside. So, I can't back that up with any conversation I've had with anyone, but that was what I heard, and a lot of them still managed to put in a word for all the irregularities that there were in this election, when in fact, the way I saw it, I was amazed that this country pulled off the pandemic election that it did, and that we had so much participation, and that there were so few cases of electoral fraud that were reported. So my view of the senators who climbed down at the last minute or others is, Secretary Chu resigned from the cabinet the next day, and
Oh, did she?
of course she's married to
Mitch McConnell, so.
Senator McConnell.
Yeah.
But she could have figured out there was something screwy about this administration before
Right.
the riot at the Capitol.
So could he, for that matter.
So could he, yes, absolutely. So could he have done. And again, you want to, in a city whose industry is politics, I guess one should be appropriately realistic and say a good deed that comes very late in the game is better than no good deed at all, and we should accept people for what they're capable of doing.
Right.
And I guess it's Mitch McConnell, I gather, in his book, which I've never read, pointed out that he always liked dealing with Joe Biden as opposed to dealing with Barack Obama, because Biden didn't try to change his mind about what he believed. He said he didn't like being lectured to by Obama about how essentially McConnell was wrong. He said Biden would come to me, understood that Biden had his beliefs, I had mine, we're different. Let's see what kind of deal we can make.
That's really interesting.
And that's I suppose that's one way to judge the behavior of politicians. And so I feel better for those who found they connected with some dignity at albeit at the last moment of this presidency.
Right, Pence, people who got off the train at the last possible moment, but they got off.
Yes, I think in Pence's case, though, for Pence to have bought into the idea, the Louis Gohmert idea, that he, as vice president, and this had been brought by the Texas congressman to court in the form of a lawsuit and was tossed out as quickly as any of the 2020 lawsuits. For Pence to have decided that he did, in fact, have the authority as vice president as someone used the example, to look inside the envelope on Oscar night and actually decide that person didn't deserve the Best Actor award, but that it should go to someone else. I mean, that would have been insane. So while I'm happy that Trump studied the matter and concluded that he had no such authority.
That's me.
But that, I'd say, was a low bar for
Pence. Yeah.
Yeah, for Pence.
So shoved from the train rather than jumping off it.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
So that, I mean, I'm curious though. You mentioned McConnell's, contrasting Obama's way with Biden's way, and you've just been immersed in this Obama autobiography that you reviewed for us, and it sounded like one of the things you came away with, or maybe that he himself came away with, was that his very rational, idealistic approach to politics maybe was a problem. I mean, maybe not only wasn't quite equal to the situation, but may have contributed to what's going on now. I mean, do you think there's anything?
Well, I mean, the first thing I would just say is that the powerful feeling I had in reading Obama's memoir, having been won over by his Dreams from My Father book several years ago, at a time when I thought that the talk of him for president was very premature, and that there was this struck me as a bit strange. I read his first book and was stunned by it. I thought he was the most self-aware politician that I had read, and that he was somebody who really had to figure out what his relationship with this remote man, this absentee father who had bequeathed his skin color to his son and hung around to give him relatively little else, and who was clearly a very bright, accomplished man, but not what you'd call an attentive father.
Mm.
And I just thought it was a terrifically good book, and bespoke a real intelligence. Reading the Promised Land a book, the memoir, I was once again reminded he's a very good writer. He's a good storyteller.
Mm.
But reading it in the waning days of the Trump administration, when we talk about what his shortcomings were as president, he's writing about his shortcomings as president. He's bringing a degree of self-doubt to his examination of his presidency that feels at the moment like it's from a different planet than the one we've been on for the past few years, because Trump shows absolutely zero capacity for self-scrutiny, for rethinking what he's doing. So there are many moments in the book when Obama takes himself to task, and I think my favorite is the issue over in what way would the stimulus package have a tax break for people, and he had two conflicting pieces of advice. Larry Summers, his economic advisor, said there should be a small extra payment every 2 weeks in people's Social Security, or a reduction in their withholding tax, I guess. And that when you give it in that way, they'll spend it. Everyone will spend the money, and it'll stimulate the economy, which is what we're trying to do to get out of this terrible recession. Rahm Emanuel, one of his political advisors, his liaison with the Congress, says that's nuts. If you have these little tiny, decreases in withholding, people won't even notice it. They won't even notice it. Give them one big check, and we'll get real political payoff from this.
Right.
And Obama hears them both out, and he goes along with the Summers argument. That is, he goes along with the economists' worthy, what's best to achieve our long-range view with the economy move,
right.
Instead of the politicians' argument, which is, how does this help me get reelected and maybe hold on to the Congress for that matter?
Right. Yeah.
And he remarks at the end of this discussion that David Axelrod, his political guy who's running their White House polling, said that more people thought that he had raised taxes than that he had cut them. There was a tax cut was a serious chunk of the $900 billion stimulus package, and most Americans thought that he had actually raised their taxes. And it's that he goes off into a riff after this, where he's comparing himself to FDR, and saying, Franklin Delano Roosevelt wouldn't have had this problem. That he said FDR, he understood that the point wasn't to get every little detail right in every program of the New Deal. The idea was to put forth the idea that the government is trying to dig us out of this thing. We're on your side, and people would have a narrative of good and bad, and how we're on the good side. He could do that, and Obama expresses frustration that he can't do that.
given that style and, Trump's style, which, if anything, he never made that mistake, although, I mean, he never was too contentful, God knows, in policy. But,
Yeah.
what do you see ahead now that Biden has the presidency and both houses of Congress? Like, what's that style going to be like? What do you
Well,
see?
he has both houses of Congress by a whisker,
Right.
and we should recall that uh, when Barack Obama had 60, he had a filibuster-proof majority in the Senate.
Got it. Kills you.
Instead, this is a 50-50 Senate with the vice president being the tiebreaker.
Right.
So I think it's going to be what he gets done will depend a great deal on what senators like first Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema, rather conservative or centrist Democrats, I should say, uh, are interested in doing. And then what some group of Republicans, the Susan Collins, Lisa Murkowski, maybe Mitt Romney, a few constructive Republicans can do. So while we might be, it might be a moment for New Deal sized programs of the sort that Barack Obama did actually come into office with a majority that could have passed anything. I think it would be a political miracle for Biden to get, say, a public option to health insurance passed
Mm.
through the Congress. I think that what I see happening is that the big question in all of our minds, the number one question, is when do we all get the vaccine?
Yeah.
And when does the economy open up because we've been vaccinated? Open up with confidence.
Mm.
And fortunately for Biden, that's really an administrative question. That's not a legislative issue for the most part. So I think the first great challenge that they face is can we just be more competent and more there for you so that you can get your arm jabbed with the vaccine shortly and show that we know what we're doing. If they can do all that, then I think it tees them up. Perhaps unlike previous recent presidencies, maybe for doing bigger things, bigger legislative things second
Mm.
after achieving what I believe is the real challenge facing this administration. If they don't get the vaccine right, I don't think much else matters politically.
Yeah. So, and this thing that just happened, this crazy day we've been through, this will recede, right? I mean,
The day will recede. Whether we are now going to have every January 5th or whatever, 6th or whatever, the returning commemorative protest on the mall,
ugh,
I don't know.
mm,
I don't know how much what kind of legs this movement has. There will be a dissident community. There will be this part of the country that just doesn't believe what the rest of the country believes, and I hope that it's just we just regard it as a bunch of troublesome wingnuts. But it's possible that it could be more difficult than that. Who knows? We just as I used to like to say when I was in journalism, it's hard enough getting right what's already happened uh,
right.
to try to get right the stuff that hasn't happened yet is probably not worth the effort.
Well, on that note, thank you, Robert Siegel, for your wisdom as always.
Amy, it's great to talk with you.